Hi Year 8, welcome to the first video on compound interest. You were going through this today with Mrs. Finch just briefly, and so I thought I'd go through it in a bit more detail today, and then tomorrow I'll show you the formula that you can use, but you really need to understand the process behind it to start with. Now, compound interest is the interest that is added to an investment amount before the next amount of interest is calculated. So in simple interest, the same amount of interest or the same amount of money is added every year. Okay, but with compound interest, the principal amount changes every year. Let's have a look at an example of how that works. So, I have $2,000 that I put in the bank. I get 10% interest every year. So 10% of $2,000 is $200. So in the first year, I make $200. My bank account will now have $2,200 in it. When I'm using compound interest, I then now recalculate my principal as $2,200. So I now calculate using the simple interest formula, and I calculate it with the new principal. So the next year, instead of only making $200, I make $220 interest. So I make an extra $20 interest. I then add that to my principal, and I now have $2,420. I use that amount as my new principal, and I find 10% of that. Now I make $242 interest. Add that together and I end up with $2,662. Now if I had just used simple interest, in the first year I would have made $200 just like before, so I'd have ended up with an account of $2,200. In the second year I would have again made $200, so now I'm at $2,400. In the third year, again, same, still only $200. So my amount that I would end up with is $2,600. So you can see by using compound interest, I've made an extra $62 on my bank account, which is really good if I'm trying to save money. Okay, let's just have a quick look at a skill. If I was multiplying the same number by itself multiple times, I can use some knowledge of indices to help me. So if I had the number 5 and I times it by itself 4 times, that equals 5 to the power of 4. We can use this with decimals as well. So if I had 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1, that's 0.1 to the power of 3. So if I'm multiplying the same number by itself, it's a slightly simpler way of writing it. I'm going to give you a couple and I want you to have a go. Let's do it. Okay, whilst I was writing that, you should have had a go. This first one here is 3 to the power of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the second one is 1.12 times 3 to the power of 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's just a quick lesson. It's going to help us with the methods that I'm going to show you in a second. Okay. Okay, find the compound interest earned if $9,000 is invested for 3 years at 13% per annum if interest is compounded yearly. Alright, let's start using the method we looked at before. So, I can use the simple interest formula to help me with this one. In the first year, okay, it's just $9,000 times 0.13, because it's the percentage as a decimal, times by 1. It's just for the first year. That gives me $1,170. Now, because it's been compounded, I add those two numbers together before I go to my next year. That gives me $10,170. That is my new principal. So I'm going to use that to calculate the interest earned in the second year. So I'm increasing this by 13% every time. So after the second year, in the second year I make $1,322 interest, and again I have to add that. Okay, I've still got 1 year to go. Again, this amount here is my new principal, so I'm going to use that to calculate my interest. And again, I'm increasing it by 13%. And to find my total amount at the end, I add that together. When we're doing this, we do end up with some pretty crazy decimals. So I end up with $12,986.07. That's a pretty long process to get an answer. There is a slightly simpler way that I'm going to show you now. What I've done in this one here is I've increased $9,000 by 13% 3 times. Now, that can also be increasing a number by a percentage. Can also be written as 113%. That's what I'm doing every time. Here, okay, on the other side. I'm increasing it by 113%, increasing by its amount and 13%. As a decimal, that's written as 1.13. So what I'm actually doing is I'm doing 9,000 times 1.13 times 1.13 times 1.13, which is 9,000 times 1.13 to the power of 3. So you can see it's a slightly quicker and simpler method than having to go through that process. In terms of your working, you only really need this on your page. As long as you've done that work correctly, you should be fine. So it's 9,000 times 1.13, and if you put that in your calculator, you'll get exactly the same answer. So there's 2 methods here that you can use. The textbook might ask you to do a specific way. The first method, use the simple interest formula, add it on, and then do it again for the next year. In the second method, think about the percentage, and you're increasing it by 100 and that percentage. So plus them together, make it a decimal, and then work through to solve it. There are some more examples in your textbook which are probably worthwhile having a look at if you think you're getting stuck with this. Today in class, so on Thursday, 1L on page 71, I just want you to have a go at questions 1, 2 and 4. With 4, you'll want to use that method that I was just showing you, method 2. Alright, I'll see you on Monday.